When we think about international adoption, many view this as some sort of humanitarian act, the saving a child syndrome. But the history of international adoption from India and elsewhere are much more complex. It is deeply entangled with religious zeal, colonial legacies, and also a struggle for national pride. Today, I want to talk about how Christian missionaries and post colonial politics have shaped the intercountry adoption system. Specifically, if we are looking at the generation of adoptees adopted in the 1970s and the 80s, where a child's destination sort of meant the difference between growing up in a very religious household or a highly secular one. More importantly, though, I'm going to look at the darker side that still persists to this day, how systemic corruption has left a legacy of falsified identities that has meant that many of these adoptions never should have taken place to begin with. Let's begin by going back to the 1970s and the 80s. This was the peak era for international adoption from India, and also a time that operated very different than it does now. Before India got its centralized secular adoption system, it was Western faith-based organizations and local Christian missions who were the primary gatekeepers. Driven by this theology of rescue, these missionaries established orphanages to combat poverty, famine, and also the stigma surrounding unwed mothers. To the Western world, this was seen as some sort of ultimate spiritual and physical salvation to send these children abroad. However, this dynamic also carried some sort of distinct savior complex because it was built on this unspoken colonial era assumption that a Western upbringing was inherently superior to anything a developing, newly independent India ever could offer. Since the generation of adoptees from the 70s and the 80s were adopted before modern regulations, where these children actually landed depended entirely on which agency handled their adoption or the paperwork. This has created somewhat of a different life experience because many children sent to, for example, the United States were intentionally placed with devout religious and evangelical Christian families. For these families, adoption was viewed as some sort of like a literal missions, a literal, what do you call it? Not literal missions, a literal missionary calling, a way to raise a child in some sort of a strict faith-based environment. At the same time, thousands of other Indian children from this exact same generation, right, has been adopted into European countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and so on, where they have been adopted into more secular homes, right? And I think that maybe Sweden, Norway, and Denmark are considered some of the most secular nations in the world, in contrast to the US, which is much more a religious nation. And I know there's always exception to the rule. I mean, there have been also people or children adopted into very religious homes here and vice versa. I'm just giving you a large stroke of everything, right? As India moved through the 1980s, the optics of this unregulated system began to change. For a nation building its post-colonial identity, the mass exit of its children to the West became a point of intense political debate or pain, if you will. Post-colonial theory often talks about sovereignty, the right of a nation to govern itself and protect its own people. Indian lawmakers, they started to ask questions like, why is a sovereign nation exporting its children? To many, this adoption boom began to mirror old colonial extraction routes, where wealthier Western nations took what they wanted from the global South. And by the 1990s, following this legal intervention, India established the CARA, the Central Adoption Resource Authority, which should regulate the system. It was also with CARA that this mandate that domestic adoption always must come first, and treating international adoption strictly as a last resort. The dark reality, though, is that even with CARA and even with decades of modern regulations, the system still remains fundamentally broken for the adult adoptees themselves. Also, behind the official paperwork, there is this rampant practice of baby selling, trafficking, and also extreme coercion. We have witnessed that poor, vulnerable biological mothers and fathers have often been lied to and been pressured into signing away rights that they may not really have understood. Today, when adult adoptees they try to initiate a root search to look into the past, they are often hit by a brick wall because the paperwork they hold is often, or it comes across very vague, right? So even though CARA might regulate the current flow of children, it has done very little to help past generations to unpack their actual own history. To wrap this up, I think we can say that the generation of the 70s and the 80s and also beyond have existed as this unique living bridge because we grew up navigating either intense Western religiosity or this European secularism, all while we have carried a history that has been stolen from us. International adoption is not just a simple story of rescue, it is also this story of colonial power dynamics and how a system has failed us to know our true identity forever. That is all I have to say for this video. If you have any input, please let me know. So until next time, have a good one and take care. Bye.